Now, continuing on with our theme, we're going to bring a new field into the fold, that of economics. So please join me in welcoming Marc Leandri from Paris-Saclay. Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the organizers because I'm really happy to be here today. I just found out about this master program, and as the dean was saying this morning, I think it's pretty unique. And if I was younger, I would really like to actually follow this degree. It seems like a great opportunity for an integrated approach across disciplines, and this is what I'm going to try and talk to you about today. How to integrate social sciences and economics in particular, since I'm an economics associate professor at Université Paris-Saclay. And here I'm going to talk about economics maybe in a way that some of you are not accustomed to. That is to say, we're not going to talk about unemployment, GDP, inflation. I like to present economics as a discipline that is trying to, first of all, to give some value. And if you give value to something, then you might be able to use this value in a negotiation, in a policy making, to try and make your point about, for example, implementing some prevention measures, and this is particularly important at the One Health level. And second, I'd like to show you how economics can contribute as a sort of a behavior science. Economics, for many economists, and for me as well, is a science of behavior. We try to understand how people make decisions, and as my colleague was showing us just before, if you understand better the perceptions that people have vis-à-vis a disease or vis-à-vis a risk, then you can better nudge them into better detection, better diagnostic, better treatment. So this is what microeconomics, behavioral economics are trying to do. So just as a very quick background, I'm by training, my colleague Laurent Dalmas and I, who tried to launch this One Health economics program, we are environmental economists, but we have a strong interest in health economics for the last few years. And we also work with ANSES, the French risk agency, which most of you must be familiar with, that is trying to assess environmental and health risk. So the One Health approach is, of course, very crucial in their work. What we're trying to do is try to sort of sketch how economics can contribute to the One Health approach, and reversely, we're trying also to show that by introducing economics into the One Health approach, you might actually gain some insights on how economics can improve and maybe diversify their way of tackling some of the health and environmental issues that are pressing today. What we did with my colleague was publish recently this article in Frontiers in Public Health, which is really more of an agenda. So it's a really new field for us we're trying to explore. And with the special topic of this edition of the IDO Day on inequalities, it led me to kind of reflect on how inequalities could be introduced as well from the economics point of view. So I'll try to give you a very fresh and maybe naive insights on how economics can address the questions of inequalities when you're talking about One Health issues. I've also launched an online forum, which is the One Health Economics Forum, where we'll try and discuss those One Health issues from an economics and more generally social sciences point of view. But it's more at the citizen level. So just to get some vulgarization, popularization of some ideas, because I think it's important to get those ideas flowing in the civil society as well. And finally, about this program, we're trying to conduct a PhD project, which would be applied both in the north with real-life expertise with ANSES, which, as I said, we are collaborating with, and also in the south with a field study with our colleagues in Senegal. So if among you, there are potential candidates, or do you know people who might be interested, don't hesitate to contact me. And here I'm more surveying the staff. If you have any funding ideas as well, because it's not easy to find interdisciplinary funding for PhD grants, so don't hesitate as well. All ideas are welcome. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with an example, because this may be the most concrete way to show you how economics can actually address One Health issues. Among you, how many people are familiar with the problem of vulture population decline in India? Okay, this is sort of a very common example of how the One Health issue, the One Health approach, could be particularly relevant to tackle some problems, because the vulture population, well, most of us don't think of vultures are very, maybe are the kindest animals. They don't enjoy the same sympathy as whales or dolphins, but they're actually very important in as providers of ecosystem services, because they dispose of the dead bodies of cattle, other animals, and by doing so, they avoid many environmental and health problems. And there's a publication by Markandia et al. That dates back from 2008. So I tried to take this article as an example of what One Health economics can be before One Health was sort of invented, as, or at least institutionalized, because what they're doing here is what I would call One Health economics, although it was before the One Health approach gained more momentum as it has today. So what they do is they show that there's been a massive decline in vulture population in India over the 1990s, and this was due to the use of an anti-inflammatory drug, which is diclofenac, which some of you might use after a hard run or muscle issues. And it's been overused in the cattle farming, and this has led vultures to poison themselves when they eat a dead cow body. Why is this a problem? Well, because this leads to two different channels of health problems. On the one side, you have in red the fact that if the decline population drops, and it has dropped by more than 90%, so it's a very sharp drop, then you will have more dead bodies, dead carcasses for feral dogs. And this leads to an increase in the population of feral dogs, which leads in an increase in animal bites, which leads in turn to an increase in rabies. So there we go to back to the Joanne's presentation before. Of course, this has some severe human health issues on morbidity and eventually on mortality as well. On the other side, you have another channel, which is that if you have dead carcasses that are not disposed of by vultures, then those carcasses will remain, for example, in a river stream or just on the earth, and this will lead to air and water contamination, and possibly to anthrax and waterborne diseases. So you have another channel of affection of human health through this, this decline of vulture population. So as you see, it's a very interesting example of the situation where the One Health prism is crucial, because you have farm animals, wild animals, sort of domestic and wild animals with dogs in red, then you have the environment in green, and eventually you have human health in blue. And what does economics contribute to this kind of problem? Well, what they did is they used all the techniques we have in economics to give value to health and environmental issues. For example, our colleague Juliette before was talking about DALYs, the way to measure the impact on the well-being of a person due to a disease. Well, you can use all this to give a sort of monetary estimation of the cost of the decline of vultures, just in terms of health consequences for humans. And the estimation they get is over a 14 years period, it's around $34 billion. So this comes back to what I was telling you in introduction, the way that economics can give you an order of magnitude of the consequences of a decline in a wild animal population, which spontaneously you wouldn't think that's very important, but they actually, their decline actually has dire consequences on health. And you can, if you can give an estimate to this cost, so you're doing valuation, then you can switch to action, because you will put these costs in perspective compared to the measures that you could implement to try and curb this decline in vulture populations. So what can you do when you're facing this problem? Well, you can do a cost-benefit analysis. Once you know the cost in monetary terms of those illnesses and those deaths that are induced by the decline of vultures, well, maybe you can actually justify investment in finding substitutes for diclofenac, or finance some programs for the breeding of vultures to reintroduce them and get the population back into shape as fast as possible. So this is the way economics valuation can lead to action in a context where you can really clearly see how imbricated animal, environmental, and human health are. And this is interesting because just recently when I was preparing this talk, I realized that there was a second article that was coming out in a top-notch economic journal, which is the American Economic Review, which tackles the same problem, but they do it on a more general geographical scale with more numbers. They also use artificial intelligence, as Joanne was showing us, to get very detailed data on the impact of this vulture decline. And this shows that these economists who are not directly concerned with One Health actually are doing One Health economics in a way. So if I want to sum up what economics with a little bit of perspective can contribute to the One Health approach, I would just mention three concepts that are keys to this contribution. The first is externalities. Externality is an economic concept that describes the fact that some agents have actions that have consequences on other agents which do not go through the market. For an economist, any action should go more or less through a market. But then when you realize that a firm is polluting a river and another firm is trying to use the water downstream, but because the water is polluted, it cannot benefit from clean water, it has to invest in purification, etc., then you have a negative externality. But you also have positive externalities, which one of the most common examples, if you have a bee farm, for example, that is next to a tree, like maybe some fruit trees plantation, well, then the fruit trees will benefit from the pollination service of the bees without having to pay for it, and that's a positive externality. And economists have been thinking about externalities for a very long time. They've designed many instruments to try and internalize those externalities. That means to make the people that are responsible for it pay for the negative externalities, or to award some benefits to the people who provide positive externality. And in the One Health framework, we are really talking about externalities in terms of negative externalities when you have a disease that goes through all the sectors, animal, human, environmental health. But also on the positive side, if you realize that investing in prevention, for example, in animal health, could actually result in the avoidance of a pandemic for humans later. So this is quite an interesting concept that needs to be applied to the One Health approach. Another concept is the burden, which is something that's really used in health economics, and as was done by the authors of the paper I presented before, the idea is to estimate the cost of a disease in terms of direct cost, what it costs to treat the patients, indirect cost, what it costs for the patient not to be able to work, for example, and intangible costs, what the patient's loss of welfare can be, how it can be estimated in monetary cost. So this is usually done in health economics, and focusing only, of course, on the human health. But if you take it one scale above, then you could actually design a One Health burden to try and evaluate the consequences in monetary cost of a disease or a pandemic or antimicrobial resistance, which we mentioned before, in all three sectors. And once again, this value could be an interesting argument when you're trying to implement or just to get agreement for prevention measures at the One Health scale. As I said, this talk led me to try and think about inequalities, what it means in the One Health approach. So I'm going to just sum up some ideas of the kind of inequalities that can arise from an economist's perspective. I found three main types of inequalities. The first is the most obvious one. It's intragenerational inequalities. It means that today there are some pretty significant inequalities in the world in terms of development, access to healthcare, and this is something economics are used to tackle through the branch of development economics, and I will try and give you two examples of how it can be addressed through economics instruments. But there's also, and this was mentioned by Juliette before, intergenerational inequalities. You cannot just focus on the present and forget that our actions today might have very long-term consequences. And this is particularly true with climate change, and climate economics is now a very developed subfield of economics, and we've been working for decades on how to introduce equality between the present generation and the future generations, knowing that our actions today are actually depleting the climate future generations will enjoy. And it's the same with antimicrobial resistance. What we do today might not affect us enormously now, but the next generations could be really deprived of any tools to fight diseases if we produce too much of this public bad. And finally, this was also hinted at before, there's the question of interspecies inequalities. This is something that you have to take into consideration because the One Health approach, when you look at it, is, as far as I know and as far as it's presented, is really an anthropocentric approach. It means that the end, the objective that people are really looking at is human health. But today, many scientists, whether in health sciences or in social sciences, and the civil society as well, are paying more attention to animal welfare. So there are some trade-offs that you could study between the measures you can take. For example, is it okay to kill an entire population of deers in one forest to prevent this kind of zoonose to develop? Or is it okay to give this kind of treatment to farm animals, knowing the side effects, to avoid the development of an avian flu or something like this? And there's a subfield in economics that is growing, very recent, about animal welfare, which could also contribute to reintroducing the animal welfare perspective into the One Health approach. So I'm going to give you two examples of intragenerational inequalities and how economics can look at those issues. First, from a perspective of valuation. As I told you, economics is the science of giving value to things. So the main difficulty that might arise when you try and apply a One Health framework is to be homogeneous in thinking that you can apply the same framework in any context. And as Juliette said before, the implementation context, I think that was what she said, is really something you should take into consideration. And this is particularly true when you compare a disease in the north and a disease in the south. And I'm going to give you the example of tick-borne diseases because those are also very good examples of how the One Health perspective can be relevant. But the impact they have is really different in the north and the south. In the north, you can have impact on human health. Most of you are familiar with Lyme disease, but also tick-borne encephalitis that can be also quite severe. But most people affected by those tick-borne diseases are either forest workers or farmers, and in that case, usually they protect themselves better, or they're forest users who go on a recreational activity. So the stake is not a very high economic stake here because we're talking more about leisure for part of the people affected. And it can have quite a limited impact on dairy production as well, because tick-borne encephalitis can affect raw goat milk, so be careful if you eat some of the delicious raw milk cheese in France. In this region, we should be safe. But there have been some issues with this dairy production. What happens in the south with tick-borne diseases can be seen as much more serious. You have other kind of borreliosis. You have the Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, which unfortunately is coming as well to Europe, but that's another problem. And you have strong impact on animal health. Actually, it's one of the most important source of productivity loss for farmers in Africa, the impact of tick-borne diseases. And when you talk about farmers in Africa, well, of course, and this has also been mentioned before, the stakes are higher because you don't have social welfare to help them in case of a heavy loss of profit, and you have much higher stakes in terms of economic issues, but as well as a food safety issue as well. So my first point about inequality is that One Health approach should really always keep in mind that the impact of a zoonosis, for example, should be differentiated whether you're in the north or in the south. Now, talking about action, I wanted to show you what the World Bank is trying to do in terms of strategy against antimicrobial resistance. So this echoes Jorge's presentation from this morning. And it's quite interesting because the World Bank, as is trying to design instruments that use economics and finance to address this kind of issues. And one instrument I found very interesting is what they call the AMR lens on development finance. So the idea is that if you apply for a development project that is financed by the World Bank, and if you include in your project what they call AMR sensitive package, because, for example, you're going to focus on water supply, or you're going to focus on sanitation, then your project is contributing not only to development, but also to the fight against antimicrobial resistance. And consequently, your project will be favored compared to other similar projects. So that's a good way, I think, to try and fight both inequalities by encouraging development projects and AMR resistance on the other side. The World Health Organization also has a lot of strategies, as was presented this very morning, on prevention. And I just wanted to add a word on prevention, because prevention works if the individual actually change their behaviors. And this is where I come back to Laura's presentation just before, and to what I was saying about economics as a science of behavior. If you understand better the way people make their decisions, the way their perception, the way their beliefs actually influence the choice they make at the time where they choose to, for example, put on some repellent against ticks, buy a mosquito net against mosquitoes, or give special treatment to their animals if they are farmers, well, then if you can understand better the roots of those choices, then you can better nudge those choices. You can better give them incentives to change them in a more integrated One Health approach to curb the diffusion of zoonosis, for example. So that's what behavioral economics can do. So what I tried to do very briefly here was to give you some ideas on how economics can provide tools for evaluation and action, as I showed you that both evaluation and action were linked. In terms of inequalities, how you should have a differentiated approach when you apply a One Health framework in the north and in the south. And as a contribution from social science, I, of course, will insist, and this was what Jorge was saying this morning when he said we need social sciences, that more interdisciplinary collaboration are needed in research, and this is what I'm trying to do with my colleagues, but also in education. So I'm really curious during the rest of the day to also have some feedback with the students of this program to see how social science are presented or not presented in their degree during their education here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, open the floor to questions. Yeah, got one on the left, one in the middle.
Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. My name is Alicia Brand. I work for the GIZ, and I work on a project on pandemic prevention, but at the macroeconomic level. So we actually try to convince of the economic benefits of primary pandemic prevention by targeting governments. And so I was just interested if you have some data or something, or you investigated also the behavioral economics at a macroeconomic scale on the policy level, because in my humble opinion, like pandemic prevention, yes, we individuals make our choices also, but it has to come like from the bigger wheels really to have an impact.
Sure. Thank you for this remark. It's really exactly what we will try to do in the future. As I said, this is a very recent research program. Maybe I can show you just this figure that was that can be found in the only really macroeconomics, One Health macroeconomics is the World Bank report of 2022, and they have this figure which is really, I think, quite relevant. In terms of global contribution, they state that prevention through the One Health approach could generate savings as high as 6 billion per year. So this is like an order of magnitude, once again, to try and convince the policymakers that they should really get on with it. And on a more specific level, you have here the impact on the GDPs of different groups of countries. On the left side, you have the impact of the financial crisis, and in the middle and on the right, you have the impact of antimicrobial resistance. So what happens if in a low antimicrobial resistance scenario, you will have a drop in GDP by this order of magnitude by 2050, but if we are in a high AMR scenario, then the drop could be even sharper. And this is interesting because it also shows you with the black minus 5.6% line here, that the low-income countries, in that case, would be the most affected. So to come back to the topic of the day, inequalities, in terms of macroeconomic inequalities, there you have a very concrete